The wind howled through the canyon as Virginia Sanchez pressed her back against the rough stone wall, her swollen belly making it impossible to find comfort against the unforgiving rock. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, and her left eye was swelling shut from where Dennis Smith had struck her just hours before. The bruises on her arms told the story of weeks of escalating violence, each mark a testament to her late husband's brother's growing desperation to claim what he believed was rightfully his. "Please," she whispered to the empty wilderness, her voice barely audible above the storm that raged through the mountains. "Someone help me." The words felt hollow in the vastness of the Colorado Territory, where the nearest neighbor was 20 miles away, and the law was nothing more than a distant memory. Her hands trembled as she cradled her belly, feeling the life within her kick against her ribs, as if sensing her fear. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart race. Dennis had found her again. She had thought the storm would cover her tracks, that the winding canyon paths would confuse even his experienced eye, but she had underestimated his determination to possess everything that had belonged to his deceased brother, including her. "Virginia!" Dennis's voice echoed off the canyon walls, distorted by the wind but unmistakably filled with rage. "You can't hide from me forever. That baby you're carrying is a Smith, and it belongs with family." She closed her eyes and tried to make herself smaller against the rock face, knowing it was futile. The narrow ledge she had found offered little protection, and her condition made it impossible to climb higher or run farther. 6 months pregnant and exhausted from days of fleeing, she had reached the end of her strength. The hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by Dennis's continued shouting. "You think you can take my brother's child and disappear? You think some judge in Denver is going to let a Mexican woman keep a Smith heir?" His words cut through her like knives, each syllable designed to remind her of how powerless she was in this world of men who saw her as nothing more than property to be claimed or discarded. Virginia had been married to Thomas Smith for 3 years before consumption took him. 3 years of happiness that felt like a lifetime ago. Thomas had been different from his brother, gentle where Dennis was cruel, protective where Dennis was possessive. When Thomas died, Dennis had waited exactly 1 month before showing up at her door with papers he claimed gave him authority over her late husband's estate, including her. "The law says a woman can't inherit property without a male relative to oversee it," Dennis had explained that first day, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Lucky for you, I'm willing to take on that burden. All you have to do is marry me, and everything stays in the family." When Virginia refused, Dennis's true nature revealed itself. The threats came first, then the visits in the middle of the night, then the physical violence that left her afraid to sleep in her own home. She had tried to reach the territorial authorities, but Dennis had friends in the right places, men who saw nothing wrong with a brother-in-law claiming his deceased brother's widow and unborn child. Now, as she pressed herself against the cold stone and listened to Dennis's approach, Virginia wondered if she would live to see her child born. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and she whispered a prayer in Spanish, the language of her childhood that Thomas had loved to hear, but Dennis forbade her to speak. The sound of a different horse's hooves made her look up through the driving rain. Someone else was coming up the canyon trail. Someone Dennis clearly hadn't expected based on the sudden silence that followed his shouting. Virginia held her breath, unsure whether this new arrival meant salvation or simply another threat to face. "That's far enough, Smith." The voice was deep and calm, carrying easily through the storm despite its measured tone. Virginia had never heard it before, but something in its steady confidence made her heart beat faster with hope rather than fear. "This doesn't concern you, Lionel," Dennis replied, his voice losing some of its earlier bravado. "This is family business." "Family business doesn't usually involve chasing pregnant women through mountain storms," the stranger Lionel responded. Virginia could hear the disapproval in his tone, though he spoke without raising his voice. "Seems to me like the lady doesn't want your company." "The lady is my brother's widow, and she's carrying his child. That makes it my responsibility to look after her interests." "Funny way of looking after someone, leaving bruises on their face." Virginia's breath caught. This stranger could see her injuries even through the storm and distance. She pressed her hand to her swollen cheek, remembering how Dennis had struck her when she tried to barricade herself in the cabin 3 days ago. That was when she'd finally run, knowing that staying meant certain death for both her and her unborn child. "You don't understand the situation, Thompson," Dennis said, and Virginia noticed how he used the man's surname now, a sign of respect or perhaps fear. She's not thinking clearly, what with the pregnancy and grief making her emotional. Women in her condition need strong guidance. "What I understand is that you're harassing a woman who's made it clear she wants nothing to do with you." Lionel's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath the calm surface. "And what I understand is that you need to turn around and head back down this mountain before the storm gets worse." Virginia dared to peek around the edge of the rock outcropping that sheltered her. Through the rain and gathering darkness, she could make out two figures on horseback facing each other on the narrow trail below her hiding spot. Dennis sat hunched forward on his horse, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. The other man, Lionel Thompson, sat straight in his saddle despite the driving rain, seemingly unbothered by the storm that had everyone else seeking shelter. Even in the dim light, Virginia could see that Lionel was a large man, broad-shouldered and tall, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. His dark hair was plastered to his head by the rain, but his posture remained relaxed and confident. He wore the practical clothing of a mountain man: heavy coat, sturdy boots, and the kind of hat that had seen years of weather. "This is your last warning, Thompson," Dennis called out, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "Ride away now, or I'll make sure you regret interfering in Smith family business." "I don't think you will," Lionel replied, and Virginia heard something in his voice that made her shiver despite the cold. It wasn't a threat, exactly, but rather the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down danger before and emerged victorious. "Because if you draw that gun, you better be prepared to use it. And if you use it, you better not miss." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and rain. Virginia could see Dennis's indecision in the way he shifted in his saddle, clearly weighing his options. He was a bully and a coward at heart, the kind of man who preyed on those weaker than himself but backed down when faced with real opposition. "This isn't over," Dennis finally said, his voice carrying less conviction than his words suggested. "That woman and her child belong with family, and I'll see that they get what's coming to them. If I see you anywhere near her again," Lionel said quietly, "you'll get what's coming to you, and I promise you won't like it." Virginia watched as Dennis wheeled his horse around and disappeared back down the trail, swallowed by the storm as quickly as he had emerged from it. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that her nightmare was over, but experience had taught her to be cautious about trusting anyone, especially men who appeared too good to be true. Lionel remained motionless on his horse for several minutes, apparently listening to make sure Dennis was truly gone. Then he dismounted and began leading his horse up the trail, moving with the sure-footed confidence of someone who knew these mountains intimately. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice gentler now, but still carrying clearly through the storm. "I know you're up there somewhere. You don't have to be afraid of me. I'm not going to hurt you." Virginia remained hidden, torn between her desperate need for help and her hard-learned wariness of strangers. Dennis had seemed trustworthy at first, too, playing the role of concerned brother-in-law until she was isolated and vulnerable enough for him to show his true nature. "My name is Lionel Thompson," the man continued, still moving slowly up the trail. "I live about 5 miles north of here, up in the high country. I was heading home when I heard the shouting and figured someone might need help." The kindness in his voice was almost harder to bear than Dennis's cruelty had been. Virginia had grown accustomed to expecting the worst from people, and this stranger's apparent concern threatened to break down the walls she had built around her heart. She pressed her face against the cold stone and tried not to cry, knowing that tears would only make her more vulnerable. "I can see you there, ma'am," Lionel said gently. And Virginia realized her hiding spot wasn't as effective as she had hoped. "I can see that you're hurt, and I can see that you're with child. You can't stay out here in this storm. Not in your condition. Let me help you." "How do I know you're not working with him?" Virginia called out, her voice hoarse from cold and fear. "How do I know this isn't just another trick?" Lionel stopped walking and stood perfectly still for a moment, apparently considering her question seriously. "I suppose you don't know," he admitted. "And I suppose you have good reason not to trust anyone right now. But I can tell you this. If I was working with Dennis Smith, I wouldn't have run him off. I would have helped him drag you back down that mountain. The logic was sound, but Virginia had learned not to rely on logic alone. Men like Dennis were skilled at manipulation, at saying exactly what their victims wanted to hear until it was too late to escape. Still, the cold was seeping through her inadequate clothing, and she could feel her strength ebbing with each passing minute. "What do you want from me?" she asked, hating how weak her voice sounded. "Right now? I want to get you somewhere warm and dry before you catch your death out here," Lionel replied. "Beyond that, I want to make sure you and your baby are safe. That's all." Virginia closed her eyes and tried to think through her options. She could stay hidden and hope the storm passed before hypothermia set in, but that seemed unlikely given how cold she already felt. She could try to continue running, but she knew she didn't have the strength to make it much farther, especially not in her condition. Or she could trust this stranger who had already proven himself by driving Dennis away. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "what guarantee do I have that you won't just turn me over to Dennis later? What's to stop you from deciding that he has the legal right to claim me and my child?" "Nothing," Lionel said honestly. "Nothing except my word that I won't let anyone hurt you or your baby while you're under my protection. I know that might not mean much to you right now, but it's all I can offer." His honesty was surprising. Most men would have made grand promises they had no intention of keeping, but Lionel seemed to understand that trust had to be earned rather than demanded. Virginia found herself studying his silhouette in the darkness, trying to read his intentions in his posture and tone. "I have money," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Not much, but some. I can pay you for your help." "I don't want your money," Lionel replied, and there was something almost sad in his voice. "I've got everything I need up in my cabin. What I don't have is a clear conscience if I leave a pregnant woman to freeze to death in a mountain storm." Virginia felt something crack inside her chest. Some wall she had built around her heart to protect herself from further disappointment. This man was offering to help her without expecting anything in return. Something she had almost forgotten was possible. Thomas had been like that once, before Dennis's cruelty had taught her to expect the worst from everyone. "I'm scared," she whispered, the admission torn from her lips by exhaustion and desperation. "I know," Lionel said gently, "but you don't have to be scared of me. I give you my word that no harm will come to you in my home." Virginia took a shaky breath and made her decision. Staying hidden meant certain death for both her and her child, while going with this stranger offered at least a chance of survival. She had to trust someone eventually, and Lionel Thompson had already proven himself more trustworthy than any other man she had encountered since Thomas's death. "All right," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I'll come with you." Lionel waited patiently as Virginia carefully made her way down from her hiding spot, moving slowly to accommodate her pregnancy and injuries. When she finally reached the trail, he got his first clear look at the extent of Dennis's abuse, and she saw his jaw tighten with suppressed anger. "Jesus," he breathed, taking in her swollen face and the bruises that showed even in the dim light. "He did this to you?" Virginia nodded, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. She knew she looked terrible, her hair matted with rain and blood, her dress torn and muddy from days of running. But Lionel's expression held only concern and anger on her behalf, not the disgust or judgment she had expected. "Can you ride?" he asked, gesturing toward his horse. "I think so," Virginia replied, though she wasn't entirely sure. She had ridden before her pregnancy, but that felt like a lifetime ago, and her current condition made everything more complicated. Lionel helped her mount his horse with gentle efficiency, his large hands steady and reassuring, as he guided her into the saddle. Then he swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins without making her feel trapped or threatened. Virginia found herself leaning back against his solid chest, drawing warmth from his body as they began the journey to his cabin. The ride through the storm was a blur of cold rain and swaying motion, but Virginia felt safer than she had in months. Lionel's presence behind her was reassuring rather than threatening, his steady breathing and calm demeanor helping to ease some of the tension that had become her constant companion. When she began to shiver uncontrollably, he pulled his heavy coat around both of them, sharing his warmth without comment or expectation. Almost there, he murmured when Virginia began to sway with exhaustion. Just a little farther. True to his word, they soon emerged into a small clearing where a sturdy log cabin sat nestled against the mountainside. Smoke rose from the chimney and warm light spilled from the windows, creating an image of safety and comfort that brought tears to Virginia's eyes. It had been so long since she had seen a place that looked like home rather than a prison. Lionel helped her down from the horse and guided her to the cabin door, his hand steady on her elbow as she struggled to maintain her balance. Inside, the warmth hit her like a physical blow, and she swayed on her feet as her body began to thaw. "Easy there," Lionel said, catching her before she could fall. "Let's get you settled by the fire." The cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, and what appeared to be a bedroom visible through an open doorway. Everything was clean and well-maintained, with the kind of careful organization that spoke of a man who lived alone but took pride in his surroundings. Lionel settled Virginia in a chair by the fireplace and immediately began building up the fire, adding logs until the flames roared high and bright. Then he disappeared into the bedroom and returned with an armload of blankets, which he wrapped around her with the same gentle efficiency he had shown throughout their journey. "I'm going to tend to my horse," he said, pulling on his coat. "There's coffee on the stove if you want some, and bread in that tin on the table. Help yourself to whatever you need." Virginia nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak. When Lionel left, she allowed herself to really look around the cabin for the first time. It was a bachelor's home, clearly, but it was also comfortable and welcoming in a way that Dennis's house had never been. Books lined one wall, and she could see evidence of various hobbies and interests: woodworking tools, fishing gear, and what appeared to be medical supplies neatly organized on a shelf. The warmth of the fire and the safety of the cabin gradually worked their magic on Virginia's exhausted body and mind. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to truly relax, letting the blankets and heat chase away the bone-deep cold that had settled into her bones during her flight through the mountains. When Lionel returned, he found her asleep in the chair, her head tilted back and her breathing deep and even. He studied her face in the firelight, taking note of the bruises and cuts that told the story of Dennis Smith's abuse. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he imagined what this woman had endured, but he forced himself to remain calm. She needed rest and healing, not his anger. Moving quietly so as not to wake her, Lionel prepared a simple meal and set it aside for when Virginia woke up. Then he settled into the other chair by the fire and kept watch, determined to make good on his promise that no one would hurt her again. Virginia woke several hours later to find Lionel still sitting across from her, his eyes alert despite the late hour. She started to sit up, wincing as her bruised body protested the movement. "How are you feeling?" Lionel asked, his voice soft in the quiet cabin. "Better," Virginia replied and realized it was true. The warmth and rest had done wonders for her physical condition, though the fear and uncertainty still lingered in her mind. "Thank you for bringing me here. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." "You don't need to thank me," Lionel said. "Any decent person would have done the same thing." Virginia shook her head. "You'd be surprised how few decent people there are in the world. At least, how few I've encountered lately." Lionel studied her face in the firelight, seeing not just the physical damage Dennis had inflicted, but the deeper wounds to her spirit. "Tell me about your husband," he said gently. "Thomas, wasn't it?" A smile crossed Virginia's face for the first time since Lionel had met her. "Thomas was a good man," she said softly. "Nothing like his brother. He was kind and gentle, and he loved me for who I was, not what I could give him." "How long were you married?" 3 years. 3 wonderful years. Virginia's hand moved unconsciously to her belly. "He was so excited about the baby. He used to talk to it every night, telling it stories about the adventures they would have together." "What happened to him?" Lionel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Consumption," Virginia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It took him quickly, which was a mercy, I suppose. He didn't suffer long." She paused, staring into the fire. "Dennis showed up at the funeral with papers claiming authority over Thomas's estate. He said the law required a male relative to oversee any property left to a woman, especially a woman of Mexican heritage." Lionel's jaw tightened. "And you believed him?" "I didn't know what to believe. I was grieving and alone, and Dennis seemed to know exactly what legal documents to produce to support his claims. When I tried to consult with a lawyer in town, I discovered that Dennis had already spoken to him, painting me as an unstable widow who needed male guidance. So you were trapped. Completely. Dennis made it clear that my choices were to marry him or lose everything, including my child once it was born. He said no court would award custody of a Smith heir to a Mexican woman over a blood relative. Virginia's voice broke on the last words, and Lionel felt his anger toward Dennis Smith grow even stronger. He had known men like Dennis before, bullies who used the law and social prejudice as weapons against those weaker than themselves. When did he start hitting you? Lionel asked quietly. Virginia looked up at him, surprised by the direct question. Most people danced around the subject of domestic violence, too uncomfortable to address it head-on, but Lionel's eyes held only compassion and a desire to understand what she had endured. The first time was about a month after Thomas died, she admitted. I had refused his marriage proposal again, and he lost his temper. He apologized afterward, said it was grief and stress that made him lash out. He promised it would never happen again. But it did. It got worse, much worse. He would come by the house at all hours, demanding to know what I was doing, who I was talking to. If he didn't like my answers, or if I showed any sign of defiance, he would hit me. He said he was just trying to teach me how to be a proper wife. Lionel shook his head in disgust. No man has the right to lay hands on a woman, regardless of the circumstances. What Dennis did to you was wrong, legally and morally. Try telling that to the sheriff, Virginia said bitterly. When I finally worked up the courage to report Dennis's abuse, the sheriff told me it was a family matter that didn't concern the law. He said I should be grateful to have a man willing to take responsibility for me and my child. The sheriff is a fool, Lionel said bluntly, and Dennis Smith is a coward who preys on women because he knows they have limited options for fighting back. Virginia stared at him in amazement. You really believe that? You don't think Dennis has the right to claim me and my baby? I believe you have the right to make your own choices about your life and your child's future, Lionel replied firmly. No man has the right to claim another human being as property, regardless of what some piece of paper might say. For the first time since Thomas's death, Virginia felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. Here was a man who saw her as a person rather than an object to be possessed, who believed she had rights and dignity worth defending. It was a revolutionary concept in her current world, and she found herself wanting to believe it was possible. What am I going to do? She asked, voicing the question that had haunted her for weeks. I can't keep running forever, not with the baby coming. But I can't go back to Dennis either. He'll kill me eventually, I know he will. Lionel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as he considered her situation. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful but determined. You'll stay here, he said simply, at least until the baby is born, and you're strong enough to make other arrangements. Dennis won't find you here, and even if he does, he won't get past me to hurt you. Virginia's heart leaped at the offer, but her practical mind immediately began cataloging all the reasons it wouldn't work. I can't impose on you like that. You don't even know me. And what will people say about an unmarried woman living in your cabin? I don't much care what people say, Lionel replied. And as for not knowing you, I know enough. I know you're brave enough to run from an abusive man to protect your child. I know you're strong enough to survive days in the mountains while pregnant and injured. That's all I need to know. Virginia felt tears spring to her eyes at his words. It had been so long since anyone had seen strength in her rather than weakness, courage rather than foolishness. Dennis had spent months convincing her that she was helpless and stupid, that she needed his guidance to survive. But Lionel saw something different when he looked at her, something that reminded her of the woman she used to be before grief and fear had beaten her down. I don't have much to offer in return, she said, hating how her voice shook with emotion. I can cook and clean, but in my condition, I'm not sure how much help I'll be. I'm not looking for a housekeeper, Lionel said gently. I'm offering sanctuary to a woman who needs it. No strings attached, no expectations beyond basic human decency. Virginia studied his face in the firelight, searching for any sign of deception or hidden motives. But Lionel's expression remained open and honest, his eyes reflecting nothing but genuine concern for her welfare. It was almost too good to be true, and her experience with Dennis had taught her to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you risk getting involved in this mess? Dennis has friends in powerful places. He could make trouble for you." Lionel was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant as if he were remembering something from his past. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. "I had a sister once," he said slowly, "younger than me by 5 years. She married a man who seemed decent enough on the surface, but who turned out to be a monster behind closed doors. She tried to leave him several times, but he always found her and dragged her back. Said she belonged to him, that no court would take a man's wife away from him." Virginia's heart clenched at the pain in Lionel's voice. "What happened to her?" "She died trying to escape him one winter night, fell through the ice on a river she was trying to cross. They found her body 3 days later." Lionel's hands clenched into fists in his lap. "I wasn't there to help her. I was working a job 2 states away. Didn't even know what she was going through until it was too late." "I'm sorry," Virginia whispered, understanding now why Lionel had been so quick to intervene on her behalf. "I swore after that I'd never stand by and watch another woman suffer the way my sister did," Lionel continued. "If I can help you escape the fate she couldn't, then maybe her death won't have been completely meaningless." Virginia felt a deep connection form between them in that moment, a shared understanding of loss and survival that went beyond words. They were both people who had been shaped by tragedy, but who had chosen to respond with compassion rather than bitterness. "I accept your offer," she said quietly, "and I promise I won't be a burden to you. I'll earn my keep however I can." Lionel smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features and making him look years younger. "You're not a burden, Virginia. You're a guest, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need to." Over the following days, Virginia began to settle into life at Lionel's cabin. True to his word, he asked nothing of her beyond her presence, seeming content to have another person sharing his solitary existence. Virginia, for her part, found herself gradually relaxing for the first time in months, the constant fear that had been her companion slowly giving way to something approaching peace. Lionel was unlike any man she had ever known. He was strong and capable, clearly comfortable with the harsh realities of mountain life, but he was also gentle and considerate in ways that constantly surprised her. He never raised his voice, never made demands, never tried to control her movements or activities. Instead, he treated her with the kind of respectful courtesy that Thomas had shown her, but which she had almost forgotten existed. The cabin itself proved to be more comfortable than Virginia had initially realized. Lionel had clearly put considerable thought and effort into making it a proper home rather than just a shelter. There were books to read, games to play during the long winter evenings, and even a small collection of women's clothing that he explained had belonged to his sister. "I kept her things after she died," he admitted when Virginia expressed surprise at finding dresses that would fit her. "I guess I always hoped I might have a use for them someday, though I never expected it would be under these circumstances." Virginia was touched by his thoughtfulness and by the trust he showed in sharing his sister's belongings with her. It felt like a sacred gift, and she treated the clothes with the reverence they deserved. As the days passed, Virginia found herself opening up to Lionel in ways she hadn't expected. Perhaps it was the isolation of the mountain cabin, or perhaps it was simply the relief of being with someone who listened without judgment. But she found herself telling him stories about her childhood in New Mexico, her courtship with Thomas, and her dreams for her unborn child. Lionel, in turn, shared stories of his own past. He had been born and raised in these mountains, the son of a trapper who had taught him everything he knew about surviving in the wilderness. He had tried city life for a few years in his 20s, but had ultimately returned to the mountains, finding peace in their solitude that he couldn't find anywhere else. "I always thought I was meant to live alone," he admitted one evening as they sat by the fire. "After what happened to my sister, I couldn't see the point in getting close to anyone. It seemed safer to keep to myself." "What changed your mind?" Virginia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "You did," Lionel said simply. "Meeting you reminded me that isolation isn't the same thing as safety. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is try to face the world alone." Virginia felt her heart flutter at his words, but she forced herself to remain cautious. Her experience with Dennis had taught her that men could be charming and kind when it suited their purposes, only to reveal their true nature once they had what they wanted. But as the days turned into weeks, Lionel's behavior remained consistently respectful and caring, never crossing the boundaries of propriety or making her feel uncomfortable. It was during her third week at the cabin that Dennis Smith made his next move. Virginia was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized Dennis's voice calling out from the front of the cabin. "Thompson, I know she's in there. Send her out, and we can settle this like civilized men." Virginia dropped the wet dress she had been hanging and ran toward the cabin, her heart pounding with terror. Through the window, she could see Dennis sitting on his horse in the clearing, flanked by two other men she didn't recognize. All three were armed, and their postures suggested they had come prepared for trouble. Lionel emerged from the cabin, his rifle held casually in his hands but ready for use if necessary. His posture was relaxed, but Virginia could see the tension in his shoulders and the alertness in his eyes. "You're trespassing on my property, Smith," Lionel called out, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "I suggest you turn around and head back down the mountain before this gets unpleasant." "I'm not leaving without what belongs to me," Dennis replied, his voice tight with anger. "That woman is my brother's widow, and she's carrying his child. The law says she's my responsibility." "The law says a lot of things," Lionel said calmly. "But it doesn't say you have the right to beat pregnant women or chase them through mountain storms. Virginia is under my protection now, and she's staying that way." One of Dennis's companions, a lean man with cold eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. "You're harboring a fugitive, Thompson. Mrs. Smith ran away from her legal guardian, taking property that doesn't belong to her. That makes you an accessory to theft." Virginia's heart sank as she recognized the man as Jake Morrison, a bounty hunter who worked for whoever paid him best. Dennis had clearly decided to escalate the situation by bringing in professional help. "I don't see any stolen property," Lionel replied evenly. "I see a pregnant woman who was being abused and who sought help from someone willing to provide it. If you have legal documents that say otherwise, I'd be happy to examine them." Dennis reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "This is a writ of custody signed by Judge Harrison in Denver. It gives me full authority over Virginia Smith and any children she may bear. She's legally required to return with me." Lionel set down his rifle and walked closer to Dennis's horse, his hand extended for the document. Virginia held her breath as he examined the paper, hoping against hope that it was another of Dennis's fabrications. But when Lionel looked up, his expression was grim. "This appears to be legitimate," he admitted, and Virginia felt her world crashing down around her. "Then you'll turn her over to us," Jake Morrison said, his hand moving to rest on his gun. "No need for anyone to get hurt over this." Lionel folded the document and handed it back to Dennis, but his expression remained thoughtful rather than defeated. "I said the document appears to be legitimate. I didn't say I was going to honor it." Dennis's face flushed with anger. "You can't ignore a legal court order, Thompson. That's obstruction of justice." "What's obstruction of justice is using the law to terrorize a pregnant woman," Lionel replied, his voice hardening. "I don't care what that piece of paper says. Virginia stays here until she decides she wants to leave." The third man, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "You're outnumbered 3-1, Thompson. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Lionel smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. "You boys are welcome to try taking her. But I should warn you that I know these mountains better than anyone, and I've got supplies and ammunition to last through the winter. How long are you prepared to stay?" Virginia watched the exchange with growing amazement. Lionel was calmly facing down 3 armed men, risking his own life to protect her from a fate she couldn't bear to contemplate. It was the kind of courage she had only dreamed of, the kind of protection she had never dared to hope for. Dennis's horse shifted restlessly beneath him, sensing his rider's agitation. "This isn't over, Thompson. I'll be back with more men and proper legal authority. When I return, you'll either hand her over willingly or face the consequences of your interference." "I'll be here," Lionel said simply, "and so will she, if that's what she chooses." After Dennis and his companions disappeared back down the mountain trail, Lionel returned to the cabin to find Virginia sitting in her chair by the fire, her face pale with shock and fear. "I have to go back with him," she said before Lionel could speak, That document gives him legal authority over me. If I stay here, I'll be making you a criminal. I was already a criminal the moment I decided to help you, Lionel replied, settling into his own chair. And I'd rather be a criminal with a clear conscience than a law-abiding man who stands by and watches injustice happen. But you could go to prison. They could take your property, destroy your life. I can't let you sacrifice everything for me. Lionel leaned forward, his eyes intense in the firelight. Virginia, listen to me. That document Dennis showed us might be legal, but it's not right. No piece of paper gives one human being the right to own another, regardless of what the law might say. But if the law says, the law used to say that slavery was legal too, Lionel interrupted. That didn't make it right. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking unjust laws. Virginia stared at him in amazement. She had never heard anyone speak so boldly about defying legal authority, especially not on behalf of someone like her. In her world, the law was an absolute authority that couldn't be questioned or challenged, particularly by women or people of Mexican heritage. What are we going to do? She asked, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation. We're going to make Dennis Smith's life as difficult as possible, Lionel said with grim satisfaction. He wants to play legal games? Fine, but he's going to discover that legal doesn't always mean easy. Over the next few days, Lionel began implementing his plan to frustrate Dennis's attempts to reclaim Virginia. He sent letters to lawyers in Denver and Colorado Springs, seeking legal counsel about the validity of Dennis's custody claim. He also reached out to contacts he had in various territorial offices, people who might be willing to investigate the circumstances under which Dennis had obtained his court order. Meanwhile, Virginia found herself caught between hope and despair. Part of her dared to believe that Lionel might actually be able to protect her from Dennis's legal machinations. But another part of her knew that men like Dennis usually found a way to get what they wanted, regardless of the obstacles placed in their path. It was during this uncertain time that Virginia began to truly understand the depth of Lionel's commitment to her safety. He never wavered in his determination to protect her, never suggested that it might be easier for everyone if she simply surrendered to Dennis's demands. Instead, he treated her fight as his own, bringing the same methodical persistence to her legal battle that he brought to everything else in his life. I've been thinking, Virginia said one evening as they sat by the fire, maybe I should write to my family in New Mexico. They might be able to help, or at least provide somewhere for me to go after the baby is born. Lionel looked up from the letter he was writing to yet another lawyer. That's a good idea. Do you think they would welcome you back? Virginia hesitated, remembering the circumstances under which she had left her family's home to marry Thomas. I'm not sure. My father wasn't happy about me marrying an Anglo, even one as kind as Thomas. He might see my current troubles as proof that he was right to oppose the marriage. But they're still your family, Lionel pointed out, and this is their grandchild you're carrying. That's true, Virginia agreed, placing her hand on her swelling belly. And my mother always said that family should stick together, no matter what. That night, Virginia composed a long letter to her parents, explaining her situation and asking for their help. She tried to be honest about her circumstances without going into too much detail about Dennis's abuse, not wanting to shock or upset them more than necessary. When she finished, she felt a sense of relief at having taken some action on her own behalf, rather than simply relying on Lionel's protection. Lionel read the letter before she sealed it, offering suggestions for clarification and encouragement about her decision to reach out to her family. His support meant more to Virginia than she could express, and she found herself wondering what her life might have been like if she had met someone like Lionel before Thomas's death had left her vulnerable to Dennis's predation. It was a dangerous line of thinking, she knew. Lionel had made it clear that he was helping her out of principle and compassion, not because he had romantic feelings for her. She was a pregnant widow fleeing an abusive situation, hardly the kind of woman who could offer a man like Lionel the partnership he deserved. But sometimes in the quiet moments when they sat by the fire or worked together on household tasks, Virginia found herself imagining what it would be like to build a real life with someone who treated her with such consistent kindness and respect. The response from Virginia's family came sooner than expected, delivered by a traveling merchant who made regular runs between New Mexico and Colorado. Virginia's hands shook as she opened the letter, afraid of what she might find inside. Her fears proved unfounded. Her mother's letter was full of love and concern, expressing outrage at Dennis's treatment of Virginia and offering immediate sanctuary for both her and her unborn child. Her father had added a postscript promising to use his connections in the territorial government to investigate Dennis's legal claims and to provide whatever assistance Virginia needed to escape her current situation. "They want me to come home," Virginia said, tears streaming down her face as she finished reading the letter. "They say they never stopped loving me, and they want to help me raise Thomas's child." Lionel smiled, genuine pleasure evident in his expression. "That's wonderful news. When do you want to leave?" Virginia looked up at him in surprise. She had expected him to be happy for her, but she had also hoped he might show some reluctance at the prospect of her departure. Instead, he seemed genuinely pleased that she had found a solution to her problems, even if it meant leaving him behind. "I don't know," she admitted. "The baby isn't due for another 3 months, and I'm not sure I'm strong enough to make the journey to New Mexico in my current condition. We could wait until after the baby is born," Lionel suggested. "That would give you time to recover your strength and ensure the child is healthy enough for travel." Virginia nodded, but her heart felt heavy at the thought of leaving the cabin that had become her sanctuary. Over the past month, she had found a peace here that she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. The idea of venturing back into the world, even to rejoin her loving family, filled her with anxiety. "Are you sure you want me to stay that long?" she asked. "It's a big imposition, especially with Dennis still making threats." "Dennis can make all the threats he wants," Lionel said firmly. "You're not leaving here until you're ready, and until I'm satisfied that you and your baby will be safe wherever you go." That night, as Virginia lay in the comfortable bed Lionel had given up for her use, she found herself thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. A few months ago, she had been trapped in an increasingly dangerous situation with no hope of escape. Now she had both a safe haven and a plan for the future, all thanks to a man who had asked nothing from her except the opportunity to do the right thing. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's strong kicks beneath her palm. "Your papa would have liked Lionel," she whispered to her unborn child. "He would have been grateful to know that someone was willing to protect us when we needed it most." The weeks that followed were perhaps the most peaceful of Virginia's adult life. With the immediate threat of Dennis temporarily held at bay and a long-term plan for her future in place, she was able to focus on preparing for her child's birth and enjoying the simple pleasures of life in the mountain cabin. Lionel proved to be an excellent companion during this time. He was knowledgeable about childbirth and medical care, having learned from necessity during his years of solitary living, and he made sure Virginia had everything she needed for her confinement. He also proved to be surprisingly good company, with a dry sense of humor and a wealth of stories from his years in the mountains. As Virginia's pregnancy progressed, she found herself relying on Lionel more and more for both practical and emotional support. He helped her with tasks that became difficult as her belly grew larger, listened patiently to her fears and concerns about motherhood, and provided the kind of steady, reassuring presence that she had missed since Thomas's death. It was during one of their evening conversations that Virginia finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been troubling her for weeks. "Lionel," she said hesitantly, "what will you do after I leave? Will you go back to living alone up here?" Lionel was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire with a thoughtful expression. "I suppose I will," he said finally. "It's the life I've always known. But don't you ever get lonely? Don't you ever want something more than just solitude?" "I used to think solitude was enough," Lionel admitted. "After what happened to my sister, I convinced myself that caring about people only led to pain. But having you here has reminded me that there's a difference between being alone and being lonely." Virginia felt her heart race at his words. "What do you mean?" "I mean that sharing this place with you has been the happiest I've been in years," Lionel said quietly. "You've brought life and warmth to a cabin that was just a shelter before. When you leave, it's going to feel very empty." Virginia felt tears spring to her eyes at the raw honesty in Lionel's voice. She had been so focused on her own gratitude for his help that she hadn't fully considered what their time together might mean to him. "I don't want to leave," she admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I know I have to, for the baby's sake and for my own safety, but I don't want to go." Lionel looked at her in surprise. Your family loves you, Virginia. They want to help you build a new life. I know, and I'm grateful for that. But the life I want to build is here, with you. Virginia took a deep breath, knowing she was about to risk everything with her next words. I love you, Lionel. I know it's crazy, and I know you probably don't feel the same way, but I had to tell you. The silence that followed was the longest of Virginia's life. She watched Lionel's face, searching for any sign of how he had received her confession, but his expression remained carefully neutral. Virginia, he said finally, his voice gentle but serious, you're vulnerable right now, and grateful for my help. It would be easy to confuse those feelings with love. It's not confusion, Virginia said firmly. I know the difference between gratitude and love. I love Thomas, and what I feel for you is just as real and just as strong, but different. You've shown me what it means to be treated as an equal, to have my thoughts and feelings respected and valued. You've made me feel strong again, made me remember who I was before Dennis tried to break me. Lionel's expression softened at her words. You were never broken, Virginia. Bruised maybe and frightened, but never broken. The strength you've shown these past months, the courage it took to run from Dennis and fight for your child's future, that all came from inside you. But you helped me find it again, Virginia insisted. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Lionel stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered mountains. Even if what you're feeling is real, he said quietly, what kind of future could we have together? You're a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. I'm a middle-aged hermit who lives alone in the mountains. You deserve better than that. You deserve better than a pregnant widow with a dangerous past, Virginia countered. But that doesn't change how I feel about you. Lionel turned back to face her, and Virginia saw something in his eyes that made her heart leap with hope. I love you too, he said simply. I've been fighting it for weeks, telling myself it was inappropriate and impossible, but I can't deny it anymore. You've brought joy and purpose back into my life in ways I never expected. Virginia felt tears of happiness streaming down her face. Then why can't we be together? Why do I have to leave? Because Dennis Smith is still out there, and he's not going to give up easily. As long as you stay here, you'll be in danger, and so will your child. Your family in New Mexico can offer you protection that I can't provide alone. But what if we went together? Virginia asked desperately. What if we both went to New Mexico? My family would welcome you if they knew how much you meant to me. Lionel shook his head sadly. These mountains are my home, Virginia. I don't know how to live anywhere else. And you need to be with people who can help you build a stable life for your child, not an old mountain man who spent too many years alone. Virginia wanted to argue, to insist that love was enough to overcome any obstacle. But she knew Lionel was right about the practical realities they faced. Dennis would never stop hunting for her as long as she remained within his reach, and her child deserved to grow up in safety and security. So what do we do? She asked, her voice breaking with emotion. We treasure the time we have left together, Lionel said, crossing the room to kneel beside her chair. And we trust that if our love is meant to be, we'll find a way to be together eventually. Virginia reached out to touch his face, memorizing the feel of his weathered skin beneath her fingers. Promise me something, she said. Anything. Promise me that you won't disappear into these mountains forever after I leave. Promise me that you'll stay open to the possibility of happiness, even if it's not with me. Lionel caught her hand and pressed it to his lips. I promise, he said solemnly, and I want you to promise me something too. What? Promise me that you'll build a good life for yourself and your child, wherever that life takes you. Promise me that you won't let fear or guilt keep you from finding happiness again. I promise, Virginia whispered, sealing the vow with a kiss that tasted of tears and desperate love. The next few weeks passed in a bittersweet haze of love and impending separation. Virginia and Lionel made the most of their remaining time together, sharing their hopes and dreams while carefully avoiding talk of the future that would soon separate them. They were like two people trying to fit a lifetime of love into a few precious weeks, knowing that their time was running out. It was during this period that Dennis made his final, most dangerous move. Virginia was in the cabin alone one afternoon, Lionel having gone to check his traps when she heard horses approaching. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized Dennis's voice. But this time he wasn't alone with just two companions. Through the window she could see at least 6 men surrounding the cabin, all of them armed and looking ready for trouble. "Virginia," Dennis called out. "I know you're in there. This is your last chance to come out peacefully. I've got a federal marshal with me this time, and a warrant for your arrest as a fugitive from justice. If you don't surrender now, we're coming in after you." Virginia's heart pounded as she realized the trap Dennis had laid. By involving federal authorities, he had made it impossible for Lionel to simply run the men off, as he had done before. If she didn't surrender, Lionel would be facing not just Dennis's hired guns, but federal charges for harboring a fugitive. She looked around the cabin that had been her sanctuary for so many months, memorizing every detail of the place where she had found love and safety. Then she placed her hand on her swollen belly, feeling her child's strong kicks beneath her palm. "I'm sorry, little one," she whispered. "Mama has to be brave now, even though she's scared." Virginia opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch, her hands raised to show she wasn't armed. Dennis sat on his horse in the center of the group, a satisfied smirk on his face as he saw her surrender. "There's my wayward sister-in-law," he said mockingly, "ready to come home and face the consequences of your little adventure." "I'll come with you," Virginia said, her voice steady despite her fear. "But I want your word that you won't harm Lionel Thompson. He was just trying to help someone in need. Thompson made his choice when he decided to harbor a fugitive," Dennis replied coldly. "He'll have to face the consequences of that decision." At that moment, Lionel emerged from the tree line, his rifle in his hands and his face set in grim determination. Virginia's heart sank as she realized he had walked directly into Dennis's trap. "Let her go, Smith," Lionel called out, his weapon trained on Dennis. "This is between you and me now. Actually, it's between all of us and the federal government," the marshal said, speaking for the first time. He was a thin, officious-looking man who clearly took his authority very seriously. "Mrs. Smith is wanted for violation of a federal custody order, and you're wanted for aiding and abetting a fugitive. Both of you need to surrender now." "I'll surrender," Virginia said quickly, stepping down from the porch. "But only if you guarantee that Mr. Thompson won't be harmed. He didn't know about any federal warrants when he helped me." Lionel started to protest, but Virginia cut him off with a look that pleaded with him not to make the situation worse. She had made her decision, and she needed him to respect it, even if he didn't agree with it. "Very well," the marshal said after a moment's consideration. "Mr. Thompson, if you surrender your weapon and submit to arrest, I'll recommend leniency in your case. You'll face charges, but nothing that should result in serious prison time." Virginia saw Lionel's internal struggle play out across his face. Every instinct he had was telling him to fight, to protect her regardless of the consequences. But he was also a practical man who understood that resistance would only make things worse for both of them. "All right," he said finally, lowering his rifle. "But I want your word as a federal officer that Virginia won't be harmed while she's in custody." "You have it," the marshal replied, though Dennis looked less than pleased with the promise. As the federal agents moved to arrest them both, Virginia caught Lionel's eye one last time. In that moment, she saw all the love and regret and desperate hope that mirrored her own feelings. They had found each other against all odds, had built something beautiful in the midst of terrible circumstances, and now they were being torn apart by forces beyond their control. "No one will hurt you again," Lionel said quietly as the agents placed shackles on his wrists. "I swear to you, Virginia, this isn't the end of our story." Virginia wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that love could overcome the legal and social forces arrayed against them. But as Dennis's men led her away from the cabin that had been her sanctuary, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever see Lionel Thompson again, or if their brief time together would remain nothing more than a beautiful memory of what might have been. The wind howled through the canyon as Virginia was lifted onto Dennis's horse, her swollen belly making the movement awkward and painful. But even as they rode away from the mountain cabin, where she had found love and safety, she carried with her the memory of Lionel's promise, and the hope that somehow, someday, they would find their way back to each other. In her heart, she held on to his words like a lifeline. "No one will hurt you again." It was a promise that would sustain her through whatever trials lay ahead, and a love that would endure long after the mountains had faded from view.